we will repair our alliances and engage with the world once again, not to meet yesterday's challenges, but today's and tomorrow's challenges. And will lead not merely by the example of our power, but by the power of our example.
That was President Joe Biden assuring the international community that his administration will engage with the world during his term. Within days of his swearing in, Biden put words to action, signing executive orders meant to send that signal loud and clear. I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. While the Trump administration laid waste to many international agreements, for starters, the Paris Climate Pact, Biden quickly reversed course. But the foreign policy challenges facing a Biden administration are legion. North Korea recently rattling nuclear sabers, the Iran nuclear deal in limbo, and who knows where some challenge for Secretary of State Antony Blinken will erupt next. On today's program, we'll look ahead to the foreign policy agenda with David Sanger, national security correspondent of the New York Times, and Michael Crowley, State Department correspondent. Welcome to both of you. David, let me throw you a little bit of a curveball, if I may. You're national security correspondent of the Times. We've been concentrating a lot lately, of course, on domestic terrorism. But how secure are we as a nation, given the fact that we ought to be concerned about cyber terrorism, cybersecurity, nuclear weapon proliferation, what's going on in Korea? We still don't know exactly what's happening in Iran. The Mideast always in turmoil. How secure is the foreign policy situation of this country?
Well, Sam, great to be back with you. You know, I think when you think about a country's security, you really have to think about it in three different dimensions. The first dimension is, how secure are we because the world has trust in us and our word and in the functioning of our democracy? And I think the answer there is, it's been a rough 4 years. And I think a good deal of what the Biden administration needs to do to restore American power and influence and security is to basically reinvigorate our democracy at home. So that's the first step. The second question is, how are we arrayed against traditional threats? Nuclear, the possibility that one of our allies would be invaded and we'd have to come to their aid and so forth. And there, I would say, we're probably in somewhat better shape. What we've learned over the past 2 decades is no one wants to take the US military on directly. They know how that will end up eventually. There's some question about whether some of our allies, among some of our allies, about whether we would come to their aid. That's the big issue in Taiwan right now. I think it's the issue among some NATO countries that saw President Trump doubt whether or not the United States should be part of NATO. And so I think a good deal of what you're going to be hearing Tony Blinken do is to try to offer reassurance there. And then the third element is exactly what you suggested, Sam. It's the new technologies that are short of war and that enable countries that are far weaker than the United States to have influence far beyond what you would think they'd be capable of. And that's why cyber is so powerful for them. It's why the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans, who barely have any computers in use, you know, among their general population, have embraced cyber, because it's a way to undercut the power of the United States without taking us on directly and without risking a military confrontation.
Michael Crowley, you pointed out the other day in the Times that the Secretary of State, who is just coming into office, is now reviewing some of the decisions that were issued in the final days of the Trump administration, clearly designed to box in the new administration. How boxed in is the Biden administration? How much can Tony Blinken reverse some of those?
Well, thanks for having me as well, Sam. It's great to be here. And there's a sort of broad boxing in as a result of the last 4 years in which the Trump administration with its, highly unconventional, disruptive approach to the world, has essentially set, sort of diplomatic fires all over the place for Blinken and company to try to extinguish. Then there are sort of a series of specific, discrete actions that the Trump administration took in its closing days that were, meant to limit Blinken and Biden in specific ways that I think are not going to be, long-term disruptions, but will be sort of complications and annoyances that the Biden administration didn't want to have. One of them, for instance, was a sort of 11th hour move by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, supported by the Trump White House, to restore Cuba to the State Department's official list of state sponsors of terrorism, a list that it had been on for decades and from which it was removed during the Obama administration, when President Obama restored diplomatic relations with Havana. And that, will require, and that does bring some mandatory sanctions, that does make diplomacy more difficult. And it will require most likely a months-long process where it is reviewed through the entire government. And my suspicion is that the Biden administration will remove Cuba from that list. But that's an example of how the Trump administration seemed almost kind of maliciously to try to make more work, to try to complicate matters for the incoming team. There were other examples involving Iran, China, and also a designation of the Houthis in Yemen as a terrorist group that to varying degrees were unwelcome steps that Blinken and company are going to have to contend with. But, as David explained, the challenge is really a much greater, and it involves digging the United States out of this reputational hole, restoring its alliances around the world. So there are a bunch of actions that I think amount to sort of annoyances and complications that the Trump administration took in its closing days. But relative to those bigger problems all around the earth, I think that, those are not the biggest fish that Blinken and company have to fry.
David, speaking of big fish, you had a masterful story on the inaugural speech by President Biden, and you pointed out that one thing he did not mention was China. Why not?
Inaugural speeches are all about big themes. They're not about tactics. I actually think, though, that in many ways, when we look back at this speech, we will wonder whether or not he ignored the central challenge facing the United States competitively over the next 50 years. You compare it back to, say, Kennedy's speech in 1961, which was all about basically facing off against Russia. China was barely a significant power at the time. We remember that because it encapsulated the big challenge of our age. I think in a time of COVID, in a time of domestic unrest, partisan divisions, it's easy to take your eye off of that longer term ball. But at the end of the day, Biden may be remembered more for how well he prepares us for a half century of competition with China than he is for anything else. And why do I say that? First of all, the Chinese had a field day under President Trump. Now, I know that President Trump thinks he was tough by imposing tariffs, most of which were paid by American consumers. But the fact of the matter is that every time he talked about withdrawing from someplace, including pulling American troops out of Japan and South Korea, or reducing the American military footprint, the Chinese saw an opportunity to fill the vacuum. While he talked tough about stopping the Chinese from building 5G networks, the future high-speed telecommunications networks around the world, and he threatened to stop sharing intelligence with any allies who signed up for Huawei, which is the big Chinese telecommunications maker. In fact, the Chinese gained ground. And meanwhile, the Chinese managed to continue with their repression at home with relatively little pushback from the United States. So when Michael talked about digging out of a hole, the biggest hole is we've created these vacuums that the Chinese have skillfully filled. And the question is, are you ever going to really regain that that territory? Or can you build up a competitive economy, one that offers an alternative 5G, one that offers an alternative way to go manage the information flowing around the world, one that manages to spread the United States military abroad for good reasons of pushing back, that will actually succeed? And we don't know the answer to that yet.
One of the things that the new administration is going to have to face, obviously, is when to use American troops, when to use American force. Bret Stephens, in his column in the Times the other day, said, what can bring dictatorships down is a credible domestic opposition that galvanizes public indignation through exposing mockery, heroic defiance, through really coming out in support of local civil liberties efforts rather than necessarily armed defense or armed action. Where does the administration stand on that? It was not that strong in the past 4 years on human rights in China and other places. Where is the Biden administration likely to come out? Michael?
Yeah, well, I think that, first of all, on the question of the use of American force, you have in President Biden and important people around him, including the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, people who have, going back in their career many years, track records of supporting American interventions and the use of force. Joe Biden, of course, supported the Iraq War, the intervention in the Balkans, the interventions in the Balkans in the 1990s, and there are other examples. But that is a very chastened group of interventionist Democrats. And I think that, having seen our sort of endless, largely fruitless war in Afghanistan, the disaster in Iraq, and the debacle in Libya, I think Biden and many of his senior advisors are quite gun shy, you might say. And in addition, they see the polling. Donald Trump was both sort of creating a sense of public opinion and also tapping into something very real with his denunciations of endless wars and his boast that he did not initiate a significant military intervention during his presidency, which, by the way, is one of the few things I think liberals might actually like about Trump's legacy. But so I think you will see a very reluctant hand on the military trigger writ large. I do think that Biden and his advisors are believers in promotion of American values, our ideals of democracy, what a civil society should look like. And then I think that's important to them, and it's something that they've spoken about publicly. At the same time, I do think you detect a kind of humility about America's ability to enact that kind of change around the world, a sense that sometimes our efforts can backfire. And in particular, and this is something that David alluded to at the very outset, a real sense of humility about America's kind of moral authority and credibility when it comes to promoting democracy and a strong civil society. Our own democracy is in a mess. The US Capitol was stormed by an armed mob, partially armed at least, and our civil society is undergoing all kinds of severe problems. Something, Sam, that I want to write about soon is the idea of a summit of democracies, which Biden pledged during the campaign to convene during his first year in office. And a real debate has broken out among sincere, sort of former government officials and academics and democracy promotion specialists about whether this is a good idea right now, whether America has the standing and the credibility to lead such an effort, or whether we really need to lick our wounds and rebuild at home before we think much about how we're going to teach other people how to do this stuff and try to topple or pressure governments abroad.
David,
Sam, just to
yes.
leap on a brief moment on Michael's very good
Sure.
point there. I think the real challenge for the liberal interventionists, of which Tony Blinken is certainly, in that group, I think, and Biden is what do you do when you get to a humanitarian disaster that you might be able to abate with the use of American military force? Bill Clinton, whose administration Blinken was in, of course, and at that time Biden was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said the biggest regret of his presidency was not sending in forces in Rwanda, where he thought he might have been able to save many, many lives. And my memory, Sam, is that that presidency had a lot of other regrets. So it's a big statement. Blinken himself said in the past year or two that he regrets the fact that the Obama administration didn't respond more strongly in Syria, where again, there were refugees and many deaths. So I think the first big challenge may not be one that is a direct attack on the United States, but what are you willing to do to sort of back up your human rights wording?
David, a quick question on Russia. You pointed out that Biden and Putin agree on a nuclear treaty. But what about the new rumblings in Russia and the new opposition in Russia? How serious is the new administration here taking that?
You know, there's always been a sense that Putin, for all of his strongman sense, is actually more fragile and his hold on power more brittle than you would think. And in fact, you saw Hillary Clinton try to exploit that in 2012 when Putin basically fixed an election, and she called it out. Many people think that's what caused Putin to come back in 2016 and interfere in our elections, saying, well, Hillary Clinton was doing that by supporting the opposition years before. If history is any indication, these brave souls who've gone out to protest against Putin are not going to get very far. There were 3,000 arrests last weekend. That's a lot of arrests. It's a lot more people than have been arrested in the Capitol uprising that Michael referred to. But at the same time, I think there is a recognition among Biden's folks that you need to push back and push back hard on Putin, that he does not respond well to the Donald Trump approach, which was let's everybody be friends and not raise any hard issues. And so I think you saw the beginnings of that in the phone call. The real test will be how Biden responds to the SolarWinds cyber attack on the federal government and private companies, and whether or not he is really willing to make Putin pay a price that's greater than the price we've made him pay for past cyber attacks.
David Sanger, Michael Crowley of the New York Times, thanks to both of you for joining us. And next, a mayoral race with a Washington twist. Welcome back. Might this year's mayoral race run through Washington? One of the leading candidates, Andrew Yang, did throw his hat into the presidential race, while other candidates have been touting their connections to Vice President Kamala Harris, and for good reason. This year, the Washington connection might be more relevant than ever, as the city desperately needs a financial lifeline from the federal government. Joining us to talk about this is newly minted Metro political reporter Katie Glick from the New York Times. Katie, how important is that Washington connection going to be? And given the fact that we now have a Democratic administration and a Democratic Congress, how likely are we going to get any real help from Washington for the New York City budget and the New York State budget?
Well, it's great to be with you. To your first question, and happy to take that for starters, the mayoral candidates are quite divided, actually, over this question of how important it actually is to have strong connections to Washington. You have a couple of candidates, whether it's Andrew Yang, who of course ran for president, Sean Donovan, who, as he often notes, served in the Obama administration. That's a key part of his resume. And Ray McGuire, who comes from Wall Street, but was a longtime national Democratic donor. The three of them in particular have been making this case that they have relationships in Washington that are going to pay dividends at a moment when the city needs as much federal aid and as many connections to the new administration and Congress as possible. And then you have a number of other candidates who very much came up in New York City politics. When we're talking in particular about Scott Stringer, the comptroller, and Eric Adams, the Brooklyn Borough president, and allies around them. And certainly Catherine Garcia, the former sanitation commissioner, has been especially blunt about this, make the argument that regardless of who is elected mayor of New York City, folks in Washington are going to take their call. And so it's become a bit of a dividing line within the mayoral campaign. around just how much and how often and the ways that they talk about connections to Washington. But to take a step back, of course, for mayors, the most urgent relationship to manage is often the one with the governor. The governor's got his own relationships with Washington. And then, of course, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York has certainly made it a priority already to be delivering as much federal aid as possible to his home state.
Of course, it's always hard to tell, and always something like that could change. But do we have the slightest hint of where the governor stands in this mayoral race?
We have not seen him engage at this moment in the race, and certainly there's a lot of speculation around how much he might engage, if at all. We have seen from a number of the mayoral candidates, though, and those who talk about Washington connections and those who don't, is a lot of them are very eager to make the case that they would be better able to manage the relationship with Governor Cuomo than the current mayor, Bill de Blasio, has.
That's probably not saying much, though.
That is a notoriously toxic relationship, and we've seen folks on kind of both sides of that divide address that quite openly. But, to take a step back, mayoral elections are often defined by this question of who represents the biggest change from the incumbent mayor. And a part of the argument a lot of these candidates are making is that they would represent a sharp break with the de Blasio administration for all kinds of reasons, including, they argue, that they would have a more productive working relationship with Albany, which is, of course, an open question.
Although, of course, historically, the mayor and governor have never really gotten along. One of the things that people have wanted from Washington is a restoration of the deductibility of state and local taxes that was wiped out during the Trump administration. Is there any chance of getting that back?
Well, you certainly hear a number of New York politicians making that case and talking about the ways that dynamic has, they would argue, disproportionately hurt not just wealthy New Yorkers, but folks who are not quite so wealthy. And it's an illustration more broadly of a lot of the tensions between New York City, New York State, and the Trump administration, despite the fact that New York was very much Donald Trump's hometown for a long time. And so, that's certainly one element as part of a broader argument that a number of New York politicians, not just mayors, but also folks in the delegation, sometimes address when they talk about resetting that relationship with DC.
Katie, one thing we saw, as you pointed out this week, that was new in a mayoral campaign in New York City, a double endorsement. This is because of ranked choice voting, which we're going to see in the primary for the first time in June. What are the implications of that? And do we have any sense, with right now as many as 30 people running in this campaign, what is all of that going to mean? Does that mean, in effect, anybody can win?
The real implications of ranked choice voting, I know this isn't a satisfying answer, it remains to be seen, like, who that helps and who that doesn't help. There's a lot of strategizing and calculations going on right now among really all the mayoral campaigns about how this plays out. Do you want to be, is this something where name ID is even more critical than usual? Because if voters are asked to name 5 people, how many voters at this point can in fact name 5 of the contenders running for mayor? And so does that benefit either someone who's been in politics a really long time or an outsider with a lot of name identification like Andrew Yang? There's calculations around how the candidates approach each other. Is it risky, in fact, to draw especially sharp direct contrast with an opponent because you might alienate their supporters and you want to be, the sort of number 2 choice of those supporters? And so, at the same time, we have started to see some contrast drawn between the campaigns overtly and of course, no question, behind the scenes as well. And so, that is one of the biggest uncertainties in the race about which candidates that benefits. And all of them are giving thought to what they need to do to, they believe, to position themselves to be, appealing enough to a broad section of voters.
Some of the candidates have proposed some major issue things like universal income, but many of these things are beyond the scope of any mayor to provide. In terms of what a mayor can do, are there any big differences among the candidates?
There's all kinds of differences among the candidates on issues from their approach to healthcare, to differences around the matter of policing, all kinds of disagreements over what the city budget should look like and what the makeup of the police department should look like and the makeup of city government more generally. But certainly we have seen a number of candidates spend quite a bit of time talking about things, whether it's things that are typically the purview of the federal government or things that are typically the purview of the state government that actually, mayoral candidates tend to not have as much, and mayors tend not to have as much control over, but they're still talking about ways they would try and exert their influence.
A quick question, given everything that's wrong with the city, why would anyone want to be mayor now?
It is a really, really hard job. Absolutely one of the most difficult executive positions in the country, and the stakes are really, really high. And it certainly, as you know, and I'm sure many viewers know and think about it, this is a real inflection point for the city. We've seen other crises before, whether it was in the 70s or post 2001 and 9/11. But a lot of folks that I talk to who are working on this race see the stakes as similar to the stakes of the 70s or of the efforts to recover after 9/11. And so a number of these candidates say that at this moment where the stakes are so high, where the city faces so many crises, they believe that whatever it is in their background, that they are best equipped to move the city forward.
That
But
they can do it. Okay, thanks to Katie Glick, the new political reporter on Metro of the New York Times, and for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.